My name is Adrienne Hale. I'm 30 years old, and the moment I stopped being a daughter in my parents' eyes was the moment I asked them to help save my body instead of saving their favorite child again. A week earlier, they had emptied their savings to drag my brother out of jail after he got arrested in the middle of the night. By the time I called, the money was gone, the sympathy was gone, and apparently so was any reason to care whether I walked into an operating room or kept living in pain. I was standing in my small apartment in Port Mason, one hand pressed against my side, listening to my father breathe into the phone like I was the one inconveniencing him. Then he said it flat and cold, like he was choosing between replacing a tire and throwing out leftovers. If one of you has to go, better you than him. My mother didn't gasp. She didn't defend me. She just sighed softly and said, "Sweetheart, you need to learn how to take care of yourself." I remember smiling even though my vision had gone blurry. "Thank you," I told them quietly. "Now I know exactly what your kindness looks like." They thought that was the end of it. They thought I would cry, beg, maybe borrow money from friends, and then crawl back into the role I had always played in our family, the dependable one, the quiet fixer, the daughter who made everyone else's disasters disappear. But they didn't understand something important. For years, I had been the invisible pair of hands holding up far more of their life than they ever admitted out loud. And 1 week later, when I finally stopped holding everything together, my mother was screaming into the phone. My father sounded like he could barely breathe. And for the first time in my life, they were terrified of what I might do next. My name is Adrienne Hale. I'm 30 years old. And the moment I stopped being a daughter in my parents' eyes was the moment I asked them to help save my body instead of saving their favorite child again. A week earlier, they had emptied their savings to drag my brother out of jail after he got arrested in the middle of the night. By the time I called, the money was gone. The sympathy was gone. And apparently so was any reason to care whether I walked into an operating room or kept living in pain. I was standing in my small apartment in Port Mason, one hand pressed against my side, listening to my father breathe heavily into the phone like I was the one inconveniencing him. Then he said it flat and cold. "If one of you has to go, better you than him." My mother didn't gasp. She didn't defend me. She just sighed softly and said, "Sweetheart, you need to learn how to take care of yourself." I remember smiling even though my vision had started to blur. "Thank you," I said quietly. "Now I know exactly what your kindness looks like." They thought that was the end of it. They thought I would cry, beg, borrow money from friends, then eventually return to my usual role, the dependable daughter who quietly cleaned up everyone else's mess. But they didn't understand something important. For years, I had been the invisible pair of hands holding far more of their life together than they ever admitted out loud. And when those hands finally stopped, everything they depended on would begin to shake. Port Mason sits along the gray edge of the Atlantic coast, the kind of harbor town where every third person either owns a boat, fixes a boat, or sells something to the people who do. My parents owned Hale Marine Supply, a small but well-known shop that sold equipment to charter captains, shrimp crews, marina owners, and anyone else who made their living on the water. On paper, the business belonged to my father, Victor Hale. In reality, it ran because someone had to deal with the mountain of paperwork that came with operating a marine supply company in a coastal state. Permits, insurance renewals, vendor contracts, tax filings, compliance updates, safety certifications, and every other form designed to drown small businesses in bureaucracy. That someone was me, not officially, of course. I worked full-time across town at the Coastal Maritime Archive, restoring old navigation logs, sea charts, and weather journals that were sometimes older than the country itself. It was quiet work, careful work, the kind of work that required patience. I liked it. There was something deeply honest about preserving fragile things that had survived storms. The irony was that during the day I preserved maritime history, and at night I preserved my family's present. My parents liked to tell people I was the organized one. What that really meant was unpaid labor. Whenever paperwork piled up at the store, my father would slide a stack of folders toward me across the kitchen table. "You're better at that office nonsense than I am," he'd mutter. My mother, Marissa, had her own method. She forwarded me emails with subject lines like "final notice" or "signature required," followed by a cheerful message that read, "Adrienne, honey, can you take care of this? You know how your father gets." I always did, because if I didn't, something would go wrong. And when things went wrong, my parents didn't blame the paperwork. They blamed the person who hadn't fixed it in time. That pattern had been true for most of my adult life, but it became impossible to ignore when it came to my older brother. Caleb Hale was 33 years old and somehow still the center of every emergency in our family. Caleb never held a job longer than a year, not because he couldn't work, because every year he discovered a new, big opportunity. First, it was custom boat wraps, then online marine parts resale, then a charter partnership that collapsed before the first season even started. Every failure came with the same explanation: bad luck, bad partners, bad timing, never Caleb. And every time things crashed, my parents rushed in to save him. They called it supporting family. What they meant was rescuing their son. Meanwhile, whenever Hale Marine Supply faced problems, late filings, insurance complications, vendor disputes, my phone lit up. "Adrienne, can you just look at this real quick?" "Adrienne, the insurance portal says something expired." "Adrienne, we need this submitted by tomorrow." I always fixed it, because if I didn't, the consequences could hurt the business. And if the business collapsed, my parents would lose everything they had built. So I kept carrying it, year after year, form after form, until I reached 30 years old and realized something strange. I had filed more documents for Hale Marine Supply than some paid compliance managers handled in 5 years. And somehow, I still wasn't the child worth saving. The pain in my side had started months earlier. At first, it felt like a dull ache. Then it became something sharper, something that made me pause while climbing stairs or bend slightly when I stood up too quickly. I ignored it longer than I should have. People who spend their lives fixing other people's problems get very good at ignoring their own. But eventually, the pain grew impossible to dismiss. So I scheduled a series of doctor appointments, blood work, scans, more scans, and finally a specialist who sat across from me in a quiet office and spoke the words that changed everything. "You'll need surgery." Not eventually, not maybe, soon. I sat in my car afterward with both hands gripping the steering wheel, not because I was afraid of surgery, because my first thought wasn't fear. It was money, and the terrible realization that most of my savings had slowly disappeared over the years, plugging holes that weren't mine. That afternoon, I made the phone call that revealed exactly where I stood in my family. The phone rang 3 times before my mother answered. I could hear my father in the background asking something about a bail bondsman. That was how I learned Caleb had been arrested the night before, drunk, at a waterfront bar. Apparently, he had shoved a deputy who tried to remove him from the property. By noon, my parents had drained their savings to get him out. By 2 o'clock, I had become the daughter with bad timing. If you've ever watched someone realize their entire role in a family was built on quiet sacrifice, then you probably understand something about what comes next. Because the moment a person stops carrying the weight everyone expects them to carry, the whole structure starts to move. And that movement had already begun. I just didn't know yet how loud the collapse would become. But before we get there, there's something you should understand. I wasn't born the kind of person who walks away from family. I became that person slowly, one small humiliation at a time. And the story of how that happened starts long before my father chose my brother over me. The first time I realized my brother and I lived in 2 completely different versions of the same family, I was 12 years old. Caleb was 15, and he had just crashed my father's truck. Not scratched it, not dented it, crashed it. He had taken it without permission to drive a few friends down to the marina after midnight. Somewhere near the old Lighthouse Road, he misjudged a turn and drove straight into a wooden guardrail. The front bumper hung loose. One headlight shattered. The hood crumpled like paper. When my father found out, he stormed into the kitchen where Caleb stood waiting with his hands shoved in his pockets. I remember standing in the hallway holding my breath. My father's face was red with anger for about 3 seconds. Then Caleb said something that would become a familiar phrase in our house. "Dad, it wasn't my fault. Apparently the road had been wet. Apparently the guardrail had been poorly placed. Apparently everything in the world had conspired against Caleb Hale that night." My father stared at him for a moment. Then he sighed heavily and ran a hand over his face. "All right," he muttered. "We'll figure it out." That was it. No grounding, no yelling, no real consequences. The truck went to a repair shop the next day, and the story slowly became one of those funny family memories my parents liked to tell guests. Caleb's wild teenage phase. Everybody laughed. But a year later, when I accidentally spilled orange juice across a stack of paperwork my father had left on the kitchen table, he yelled at me for 10 minutes about responsibility. That was the moment I started noticing the pattern. Caleb made mistakes. I prevented disasters. He was forgiven. I was expected. And somehow, over the years, that expectation quietly turned into responsibility. By the time we reached our 20s, Caleb had already cycled through more failed plans than most people experience in a lifetime. He had charisma, confidence, the kind of easy charm that made strangers believe whatever he told them. But Caleb had never developed the one trait required to make those qualities useful: consistency. When he was 23, he launched a boat wrap business with 2 friends from high school. They bought expensive equipment, leased a small warehouse, printed business cards with a sleek logo. 6 months later, the company folded after Caleb forgot to file a state tax report. My parents blamed the partners. When Caleb was 26, he started an online marine parts resale shop. For 3 months, he talked constantly about scaling operations and shipping logistics. Then customers started complaining about missing orders. The website quietly disappeared. My parents blamed the suppliers. At 29, Caleb announced he had secured a charter partnership with a local fishing captain. That venture lasted exactly 1 season before collapsing under unforeseen expenses. My parents blamed the economy. Every failure followed the same pattern. Caleb came home frustrated. My parents reassured him, and somehow the world always ended up responsible for whatever had gone wrong. Meanwhile, every time Hale Marine Supply ran into trouble, my phone rang. Not Caleb's, mine. The truth is, I didn't step into that role all at once. It happened gradually. The first time was when I was 24. My father had received a warning letter from the state about a compliance issue tied to vendor certification. The letter used language that made it sound far more serious than it actually was. My father panicked. "Adrienne," he said, dropping the envelope in front of me, "you work with documents all day. Can you make sense of this?" So I did. I logged into the state portal, filled out a renewal form, submitted 2 verification files. The entire problem took about 40 minutes to resolve. My father was relieved. "You saved us a huge headache," he said. And just like that, I became the person who handled that paperwork stuff. At first, it was occasional. A license renewal here, an insurance form there. Then the requests started arriving more often. Soon, my father wasn't even opening certain emails. He just forwarded them to me. "Adrienne, can you deal with this? Adrienne, this portal won't let me log in. Adrienne, they're asking for some compliance document again." I told myself it wasn't a big deal. The tasks usually took less than an hour, and helping family felt normal. But what I didn't notice at the time was how deeply my name started appearing inside systems I didn't officially belong to. My email became the primary contact for several state filings. My phone number appeared in a vendor registry. An insurance representative once emailed me directly asking for clarification about operational documentation. That should have been a warning. Instead, I answered the question, because that's what I had always done. I fixed things. Caleb, on the other hand, had mastered a very different skill. He knew how to perform desperation. Whenever he needed help, his voice softened just enough to make people believe this time was different. "Maddie," he would say, leaning against the kitchen counter with that easy smile of his, "you're the smart one in this family. I just need a little help getting things organized." He never demanded. He appealed. "You're the only one I trust with this stuff. You know how Mom gets stressed. Once this business takes off, I'll take care of you, I swear." I worried for him. I worried for my parents. I worried for the business. So I helped. Again, and again, and again. Looking back now, I realize something uncomfortable. Caleb wasn't the only person who believed I would always fix everything. I believed it too. Years passed that way, quietly, predictably. Until one evening when I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by paperwork from Hale Marine Supply and noticed something strange. My name appeared on more documents than my father's. Not as owner, but as contact, compliance liaison, administrative verifier. The systems had slowly reshaped themselves around my involvement, without me noticing, without anyone formally asking, without anyone acknowledging what that actually meant. I remember staring at the screen that night and laughing softly to myself, not because it was funny, because it suddenly felt absurd. I was working full-time at the Coastal Maritime Archive, helping preserve historical records older than 2 centuries, and somehow I had accidentally become the operational backbone of a marine supply company I didn't even work for. But at the time, I didn't see that as a trap. I saw it as responsibility, family responsibility. And in families like mine, responsibility only moves in one direction, toward the person who never says no. Which is why, years later, when I finally called my parents asking for help with surgery, they couldn't understand why I expected anything different. From their perspective, the system had always worked perfectly. Caleb created chaos. They rescued him, and I quietly cleaned up everything else. The only thing that surprised them was the moment I stopped. The pain didn't arrive all at once. It crept into my life slowly, the way small cracks appear in a wall before anyone realizes the foundation is shifting underneath. At first, it was nothing more than a dull ache along my right side, something I noticed while climbing the narrow staircase at the Coastal Maritime Archive, something that made me pause for a moment before lifting a heavy storage box. I told myself it was stress, or posture, or maybe the result of too many long hours hunched over fragile documents. But pain has a strange way of introducing itself politely before it becomes impossible to ignore. Within a few weeks, the ache turned sharper. Sometimes it hit suddenly, forcing me to grip the edge of a table until the wave passed. Other times, it lingered quietly in the background, like a warning I refused to listen to. One afternoon in the archive restoration room, I bent down to retrieve a rolled navigation chart from a lower shelf. Halfway back up, the pain struck hard enough to make my knees buckle. For a moment, the room spun. My coworker, Daniel, noticed immediately. "You okay?" he asked, stepping closer. I forced a smile. "Yeah," I said, "just stood up too fast." That was the lie I told everyone, including myself. Eventually, the pain grew too persistent to dismiss. So I scheduled a doctor's appointment, then another. Blood tests, scans, follow-up visits. Medical offices have a way of making time feel strange. You spend hours waiting in quiet rooms only to receive information that changes everything in a matter of seconds. My final appointment happened on a gray Thursday afternoon. The specialist was calm and professional, the kind of doctor who spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded reassuring even when they weren't. He explained the diagnosis in measured sentences. Then he leaned forward slightly. "You'll need surgery," he said. "Is it urgent?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tapped the edge of a report on his desk. "It's not something you should delay for long." That was doctor language for soon. Very soon. I sat in my car afterward with the engine off and the medical folder resting on the passenger seat. The sky above Port Mason looked heavy with clouds, the harbor cranes in the distance barely visible through the mist rolling in from the water. My hands stayed wrapped around the steering wheel long after I should have driven home. Not because I was afraid of surgery, because my first thought wasn't fear. It was money. Even with insurance, the deposit alone was more than I could comfortably afford. My savings had once been solid, but over the years, small withdrawals had chipped away at it, helping Caleb cover a lease deposit, paying a short-term vendor fee when my father's account temporarily overdrew, fronting a software renewal for Hale Marine Supply's inventory system when their card declined. Each moment felt small at the time. Temporary? Family helping family. But sitting there in that quiet parking lot, the total finally added up in my head. And the number left in my account wasn't enough, which meant I had to do something I had almost never done before. Ask for help. I called my mother first. She answered on the 4th ring. "Hi, honey," she said, sounding distracted. "Can I call you back in a bit? Things are a little crazy here." "What's going on?" I asked. She hesitated, then lowered her voice slightly. "Your brother had a bit of trouble last night." Trouble. In my family, that word covered a wide range of disasters. What kind of trouble? There was another pause. Then she sighed. "He got arrested." That sentence alone should have surprised me more than it did. What happened? "Some misunderstanding at the waterfront bar," she said quickly. Apparently, there was an argument and a deputy got involved. A misunderstanding that involved law enforcement usually wasn't minor. What now? I asked. We're trying to arrange bail, she replied. Your father's already talking to a bondsman. I stared at the dashboard in front of me. How much? More than we expected. Her voice carried a tone I recognized immediately. Financial panic. The same tone that usually led to someone asking me to solve a problem. Only this time I was the one calling. I actually needed to talk to you about something, I said carefully. Oh, honey, she interrupted. Can it wait until tomorrow? This Caleb situation is a bit urgent. The words stung more than I expected. It's medical, I said quietly. That made her pause. What do you mean? I saw a specialist today. Silence settled on the line. Then she asked, Is it serious? I need surgery. The sentence felt strangely calm leaving my mouth. My mother didn't respond immediately. Instead, I heard muffled conversation in the background. My father's voice, sharp, impatient. What's she saying? He asked loudly enough for me to hear. My mother covered the phone. She says she needs surgery. What? He snapped. A moment later, the phone shifted hands. Adrienne, my father said, his voice already carrying irritation. What's going on? I need help covering the surgery deposit, I said. Another silence followed, this one colder. We just spent everything getting Caleb out, he replied flatly. I know, I said. Mom told me. So you understand the situation? I do. But I still need surgery. My father exhaled slowly into the phone. The sound felt heavy with annoyance. Then he said the sentence that rearranged something inside me forever. If one of you has to go, he said coldly, better you than him. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him, but the silence that followed made it very clear I hadn't. My mother's voice returned faintly in the background. Victor. But she didn't argue. She didn't defend me. Instead, she took the phone back. Sweetheart, she said softly, you need to learn how to take care of yourself. I stood there in my apartment kitchen, staring at nothing. The pain in my side pulsed sharply, but something else had replaced it. Something colder. Thank you, I said quietly. For what? She asked. Now I know exactly what your kindness looks like. Then I ended the call. Some moments in life don't just hurt. They rearrange you. Standing alone in my apartment that afternoon, I finally understood something that should have been obvious years earlier. In my family, love had always flowed in one direction, toward Caleb. And the rest of us were simply expected to adjust around that fact. For most of my life, I had accepted that role. Quietly, patiently. But something about hearing my father choose my brother over my life snapped the last fragile thread holding that system together. Because for the first time in 30 years, I stopped trying to soften the truth. They had made their choice. And now I was about to make mine. After I hung up the phone, the apartment went completely silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence. The kind that feels heavy, like the air itself has changed. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, the phone still in my hand, my father's words echoing in my head. If one of you has to go, better you than him. It should have broken me. A year earlier, it probably would have. I might have cried, called back, tried to explain why the surgery mattered, tried to convince them my life was worth helping. But something inside me had shifted. Instead of panic or desperation, I felt something strange. Stillness. A quiet clarity that spread slowly through my chest, replacing the anger I expected to feel. For most of my life, whenever my family hurt me, I tried to translate their behavior into something kinder. Maybe they were stressed. Maybe Caleb was really in trouble. Maybe my father didn't mean what it sounded like. That day, I didn't do that. I didn't rewrite the moment into something softer. My father had meant exactly what he said. My mother had agreed. And for the first time in my life, I accepted that truth without trying to fix it. The next morning, I called in sick to work. Technically, it wasn't a lie. The pain in my side had grown sharper overnight, radiating into my back whenever I moved too quickly. But that wasn't the reason I stayed home. I stayed home because I needed to think. I made tea and let it grow cold on the kitchen counter while I opened my laptop. I didn't start with revenge. That would have been emotional. Revenge is messy. Instead, I started with something far simpler. Inventory. If I was going to take care of myself the way my mother suggested, then I needed to understand exactly what parts of my life were still tied to people who had just told me I didn't matter. So I began making a list. Every login connected to Hale Marine Supply, every portal, every system, every account where my name appeared. The list grew longer than I expected. State Compliance Registry, Vendor Management Portal, Insurance Documentation Platform, Payroll Tax Reminder System, Permit Renewal Calendar, Operational Contact Database. And that was only the beginning. As I opened each account, I felt a strange tightening in my chest, because the deeper I looked, the clearer something became. I wasn't just helping my parents with occasional paperwork. I was embedded in the structure of their business. My email appeared as the primary contact on several compliance filings. My phone number was attached to vendor communication alerts. One of their insurance carriers had me listed as Operational Compliance Liaison. I leaned back in my chair slowly. How did this even happen? I muttered. The answer was obvious. It hadn't happened all at once. It had happened gradually. Each time my father asked me to just take care of this one thing. Each time my mother forwarded another urgent email. Each time I solved a problem faster than they could. The systems adapted, and over the years, the business quietly reorganized itself around my involvement, without anyone officially acknowledging that I was doing the work, without anyone paying me, without anyone asking whether I wanted that responsibility in the first place. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I opened a new document. At the top, I typed 3 simple words: withdrawal plan. Around noon, someone knocked on my apartment door. When I opened it, Jordan Cross stood there holding a metal thermos and wearing the concerned expression of someone who had already guessed something was wrong. Jordan and I had met years earlier through mutual friends. While I spent my days preserving maritime documents, Jordan worked as an aviation mechanic at the regional airport outside Port Mason. Where I was cautious and analytical, Jordan was blunt and practical, which meant they often saw things I didn't. "I brought soup," Jordan said, holding up the thermos. "You didn't have to do that." "You sounded weird on the phone last night," they replied. "So I figured either you were sick or your family did something stupid again." I let out a quiet laugh and stepped aside. "Both," I said. Jordan set the thermos on the counter and studied my face. "All right," they said, "tell me everything." So I did. From the doctor's appointment to the surgery deposit. From Caleb's arrest to the bail money. And finally, my father's sentence. Jordan didn't interrupt while I talked. They simply leaned against the kitchen counter with their arms crossed, listening carefully. When I finished, the apartment fell quiet again. Then Jordan said something that sounded almost too simple. "Then stop saving them." I blinked. "What?" "Stop saving them," they repeated. I shook my head. "It's not that easy." "Why not?" "Because if I step away now, the business could fall apart." Jordan raised an eyebrow. And my parents would lose everything. Jordan stared at me for a moment. Then they asked the question that would haunt me for the rest of the week. "Why are you still protecting their convenience?" I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out, because suddenly I realized something uncomfortable. I had spent so many years being useful to my family that I had started confusing usefulness with worth. If Hale Marine Supply struggled without me, that meant I had to keep helping, right? Jordan saw the realization forming on my face and nodded slowly. "You're not burning their business down," they said. "You're just stepping away from the fire they keep asking you to stand in." We spent the next 2 hours at my kitchen table, not imagining revenge, planning reality. I would send a written notice withdrawing from all non-employee responsibilities tied to Hale Marine Supply. I would remove my financial cards from any accounts connected to the business. I would export every document, deadline, and contact list I had ever maintained for them, and I would send it all in one organized package. No sabotage, no missing information, just a clean return of responsibility. Jordan watched me type for a while. Then they said quietly, "You know this is going to scare them." "Why?" "Because people don't realize how much they rely on someone," Jordan replied, "until that person stops showing up." I looked back at the growing list on my screen. For years, my parents had treated my work like electricity. Invisible, expected, only noticeable when it disappears. And for the first time in my life, I was about to turn the power off. The next 3 days felt strangely normal. which was the most surreal part of all. Every morning I woke up, dressed for work, and drove across Port Mason to the Coastal Maritime Archive like nothing in my life had changed. The harbor looked the same. Fishing boats moved slowly through the fog. The salty wind carried the same familiar smell of the ocean. Visitors wandered through the museum galleries, reading plaques beside centuries-old sea charts. And inside the restoration lab, I sat under warm white lights repairing a fragile navigation log from 1864. My hands moved carefully, using a soft brush to remove dust from brittle paper, preserving history, while quietly dismantling the present. Because every evening after work, I returned to my apartment and continued building the most thorough exit plan of my life. The process was meticulous. If I was going to remove myself from Hale Marine Supply, I wasn't going to leave chaos behind. Chaos was Caleb's specialty, not mine. So I documented everything: insurance contact numbers, state renewal dates, vendor payment cycles, tax submission deadlines, permit IDs, supplier agreements, delivery contracts, login credentials. I built folders organized clearly enough that a stranger could understand them. Anyone who opened the files would know exactly what needed to be done and when. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was doing the most organized administrative work I had ever done for my parents, to make sure they could no longer depend on me. On Thursday night, I finished the last document: 17 attachments, 1 summary file, 2 formal notices. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. It was strange how quiet the moment felt. For years, I had imagined the day I might finally stand up to my family. I always pictured something explosive: arguments, shouting, doors slamming. But this didn't feel like that. It felt calm, like closing a door after a long day. Before sending anything, I opened the family group chat. It contained only 4 people: my father, my mother, Caleb, and me. I typed a single message, then read it 3 times to make sure the words stayed neutral. No accusations, no emotion, just the truth. Starting Friday, I will no longer be managing any business, financial, or compliance responsibilities connected to Hale Marine Supply. I will send a full handoff package tomorrow. After that, all responsibilities return to ownership. I stared at the screen for a moment, then pressed send. The response came faster than I expected. Caleb replied first. Of course he did. Caleb, are you seriously doing this over one argument? I didn't answer. A minute later, another message appeared. Mom, Adrienne, please don't make emotional decisions when you're upset. Still, I didn't respond. Then my father's name appeared. The typing dots blinked for a moment before his message arrived. Dad, we'll talk about this in person. Don't start something stupid. I set my phone face down on the table. The silence that followed felt deliberate. For the first time in my life, I was holding a boundary without apologizing for it. Friday morning arrived with gray skies and steady coastal rain. At 9:02 a.m., I sent the email. 17 attachments, 1 clean summary, 1 formal withdrawal notice. The subject line read, Operational Transition, Hale Marine Supply. The message itself was simple. I explained that I was stepping away from all administrative roles associated with the business. I listed the documents attached, and I confirmed that ownership would now be responsible for all filings, renewals, and compliance matters. No blame, no anger, just facts. Then I hit send. For a while, nothing happened. I spent the morning restoring a damaged ship ledger inside the archive lab. The rhythmic work helped keep my mind steady. Brush, turn page, stabilize paper, repeat. But around noon, my phone vibrated on the work table. Mom. I let it ring. A minute later, it rang again. Dad. Then Caleb. Then another number I recognized from the insurance office. I stepped into the hallway and listened to the first voicemail. My mother's voice trembled with confusion. Adrienne, why are they asking us to verify coverage documents? They said something about compliance review. Please call me. The second voicemail came from my father. He sounded angry. But beneath the anger was something new: fear. The insurer says if we don't update these documents immediately, they can't confirm active coverage for next week's delivery contract. What exactly did you tell them? I leaned against the hallway wall and closed my eyes for a moment. What had I told them? The truth. That I was no longer responsible for a company I didn't own. By the time my shift ended, my phone contained 12 missed calls, 3 from my mother, 4 from my father, 5 from Caleb. I walked outside into the damp Port Mason evening and sat inside my car. Then I finally opened my messages. The newest one came from my father. "Dad, do you understand what this could cost us?" I stared at the words for a moment, then typed my response. "Me, do you understand what surgery costs?" There was no reply, just silence, heavy and immediate. Jordan came over that evening with groceries and a look that suggested they already knew what had happened. "Well?" they asked. It started. Jordan leaned against the counter. "How bad?" I handed them my phone. They scrolled through the missed calls and raised their eyebrows. "That bad, huh?" I nodded. The insurer flagged their policy. Jordan whistled softly. "That's gonna hurt." "It's only a review," I said. "But they never had to deal with it before." "Because you handled everything." "Exactly." Jordan studied me for a moment, then asked quietly, "You okay?" I thought about the question carefully. The pain in my side was worse than usual. My parents were probably panicking. Caleb was almost certainly furious. And yet, I felt lighter than I had in years. "Yeah," I said finally. Jordan nodded slowly. Then they said something that made me laugh. "You realize this is the part of the story where most people suddenly start paying attention." "What do you mean?" "They ignored everything you did for years," Jordan said. "But the moment you stop fixing things, they notice immediately." That night, while rain tapped softly against the windows of my apartment, my phone lit up again. This time it was my mother. I let it ring until voicemail answered. Her voice arrived seconds later, shaking with panic. "Adrienne, please call me back right now. The marina says they can't release the McAllister order until the insurance issue is confirmed. I don't understand what's happening." I sat on the couch, listening quietly. Then the message ended. For years, every crisis in my family had ended the same way. Someone called me, and I fixed it. But this time, I simply placed the phone on the table. If you've ever wondered what happens when someone finally stops carrying the weight everyone expects them to carry, you're about to find out. Because this wasn't revenge. This was something far more dangerous. Reality. The real explosion didn't happen the moment I sent the email. It started the next morning, Saturday. I woke up later than usual, the pale gray light of a cloudy Port Mason morning slipping through the curtains of my apartment. For the first few seconds, everything felt normal. Then I moved. A sharp pulse of pain ran through my side, reminding me why the past week had begun in the first place. Surgery. The word hovered quietly at the edge of my thoughts. For a moment, I lay still, staring at the ceiling. My parents were probably awake already. My father likely pacing around the office at Hale Marine Supply. My mother calling vendors. Caleb complaining about how unfair everything was. The strange part was how calm I felt imagining it. Because for the first time in years, none of it was my responsibility. I made coffee slowly, moving carefully around the kitchen. Halfway through pouring a cup, my phone buzzed on the counter. "Dad." I let it ring. A few seconds later, the phone vibrated again, then again. 3 calls in less than 2 minutes. Finally, a voicemail appeared. I waited until the coffee finished brewing before pressing play. My father's voice burst through the speaker. "What exactly did you tell the insurance company?" His tone was sharp, but underneath it I heard something unfamiliar. Panic. "They're saying the policy needs owner verification now," he continued. "They've never asked for that before. Did you report something?" I leaned against the counter and stared at the quiet kitchen. No, I hadn't reported anything. I had simply removed myself from a system that had quietly depended on me for years. That alone had triggered the review, which meant the business wasn't collapsing because of anything I had done. It was collapsing because the structure had always been fragile. My father just hadn't noticed. Until now. The next voicemail came from my mother. Her voice sounded strained. "Adrienne, honey, please call us back. The marina manager says the McAllister shipment is on hold until the insurance verification clears." I closed my eyes briefly. The McAllister order. It was one of their largest supply contracts that month. If the marina delayed payment, it would hurt. Badly. Not because I had sabotaged anything, because businesses require attention. And for years, I had quietly been the person giving it. Around noon, another message arrived. This time from Caleb. "Caleb, you're being ridiculous." A second message appeared almost immediately. "Dad says this whole insurance mess is because of you." Then a third. You seriously going to tank the family business over hurt feelings? I stared at the screen. For years, Caleb had treated every crisis like a performance. He framed himself as the misunderstood one, the victim of bad luck, the brother who just needed a little more support. But this time, something about his words didn't bother me the way they used to. Maybe because the pattern had finally become impossible to ignore. When Caleb made mistakes, the family protected him. When I stepped away, I was the problem. Jordan stopped by that afternoon with groceries and their usual direct energy. You look tired, they said, stepping into the apartment. Pain medication, I replied. Jordan set the bags on the counter. Any new disasters? I handed them my phone. They scrolled through the messages slowly. Wow, they said finally, they're panicking. I shrugged. They're dealing with normal business responsibilities. Jordan laughed softly. Normal responsibilities they've been outsourcing to you for years. I poured them a cup of coffee. They think I sabotaged something. Jordan leaned back against the counter. Did you? No. Then what actually happened? I thought about that question carefully. I told the truth. Jordan nodded once, and the truth triggered a review. Exactly. Which exposed how much they relied on you. Yes. Jordan smiled faintly. That's not sabotage, they said. That's reality. Around 3 p.m, my phone rang again. Dad. This time I answered. The silence on the other end lasted a full second before he spoke. You're tanking your own family, he said immediately. His voice carried a tight edge. Do you understand what this could cost us? I leaned against the living room wall and stared out the window. The harbor cranes in the distance looked like dark skeletons against the cloudy sky. Do you understand what surgery costs? I asked quietly. The silence that followed stretched longer. Finally, he exhaled sharply. Don't do that. Do what? Turn this into something it's not. I closed my eyes for a moment. It's exactly what it is. You're being vindictive, he snapped. No, I said calmly. I'm being unavailable. He didn't respond. For the first time in my life, my father didn't have an immediate argument ready. Maybe because the dynamic he relied on had suddenly disappeared. The version of me who rushed to solve every problem wasn't there anymore. After a few seconds, he tried a different tactic. We can figure out your surgery money later. Later? The word echoed in my head. Later, like every other promise that had quietly evaporated over the years. After Caleb starts another business? I asked. Silence. After Mom misses more appointments I'm supposed to schedule? I continued. Still silence. After you forget another filing deadline and act shocked it exists? His breathing grew heavier. You're making a mistake, he said. Maybe, but for the first time in 30 years, it felt like the right one. That evening, Jordan drove me to a pre-operation consultation at the hospital. The waiting room was quiet, filled with the low murmur of patients flipping through magazines and scrolling their phones. My own phone buzzed repeatedly in my bag. I didn't check it. Not yet. Instead, I focused on breathing slowly while the pain in my side pulsed steadily. Eventually, curiosity won. I opened my messages. Dozens of notifications. My mother, my father, Caleb. Even a number from the marina office. Jordan glanced over. Bad? I nodded. Very. Jordan studied my face for a moment. You still thinking about fixing it? The question hung in the air because the truth was uncomfortable. A part of me still wanted to drive straight to Hale Marine Supply, log into every portal, solve every problem, make everything stable again. Not because they deserved it, because I had spent my entire life believing collapse was my fault if I could prevent it. Jordan seemed to read that thought on my face. You're not responsible for their panic, they said quietly. I know. Then let them experience it. I looked down at my phone one last time before putting it away. The newest message came from Caleb. Family should come before pride. Jordan saw the screen and snorted. That from the guy who just got bailed out of jail? I nodded. Then I locked the phone and slipped it into my bag. For years, my family had depended on one simple assumption, that no matter how badly things went, I would always step in. But something about hearing my father say my life mattered less than my brother's had finally changed that. Because once a person learns exactly how replaceable they are in someone else's eyes, they start realizing something important. They're free to leave. 2 days later, my father demanded a meeting, not asked. Demanded. The message arrived late Monday morning while I was sitting at my desk in the Coastal Maritime Archive, carefully stabilizing the spine of a brittle logbook from 1881. My phone buzzed once on the table, then again. Finally, I glanced down. Dad, be at the store tonight at 6. We're settling this. I stared at the message for a long moment. The words weren't surprising. My father had always believed every conflict could be solved by pulling people into the same room and forcing them to agree with him. But this time, something about the tone felt different. It didn't sound confident. It sounded desperate. Jordan was the first person I showed the message to. They had stopped by the archive that afternoon with a sandwich and the same steady energy they had brought into my life since this whole situation began. Jordan read the message and let out a quiet laugh. That sounds less like a meeting and more like a trial. Probably both, I said. You going? I hesitated. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Walking back into Hale Marine Supply meant stepping into the center of the storm I had just created. But another part of me was tired of something. Tired of being discussed like a malfunction. Tired of being blamed for problems that existed long before I stepped away. I'll go, I said finally. Jordan nodded. Then I'm driving. I can drive. You're waiting on surgery and your brother just spent a week blaming you for everything, Jordan replied calmly. I'm driving. That evening, we parked across the street from Hale Marine Supply. The building looked exactly the way it always had. Weathered wooden siding, a faded blue sign above the door, rows of marine rope, flares, and safety gear visible through the front windows. For years, that place had felt familiar, comfortable. Now it felt like walking toward a courtroom. Jordan turned off the engine and looked at me. You sure you want to do this? No, I said honestly. Good, Jordan replied. That means you're thinking clearly. They leaned back in their seat. I'll be right here if things get loud. I nodded once, opened the door, and crossed the street. Inside, the store smelled the same as always. Salt, dust, old wood. But the atmosphere felt different, tighter. My father was pacing behind the counter. My mother sat at the office desk with a stack of printed emails in front of her. Caleb leaned against a filing cabinet with his arms crossed, looking irritated rather than concerned. None of them smiled when I walked in. Sit down, my father said immediately. I stayed standing. Say what you need to say. That seemed to irritate him. He slapped a folder onto the desk. Because of you, he said sharply, our insurance policy got flagged. I didn't respond. He continued. Because of you, the marina delayed the McAllister shipment. Still silence. And because of you, he added, the state portal is demanding direct owner verification in the middle of our busiest month. I looked at the folder on the desk, then back at him. Because of me? I asked calmly. Yes. No, I said. Because of years of letting me do your job. The room went quiet. Caleb rolled his eyes dramatically. Jesus, Maddie, he muttered. You act like you built the whole business. I turned toward him so quickly he stopped talking. I kept it legal, I said. That's more than you've ever done. Jordan, visible through the office window outside, actually laughed. Caleb scowled but didn't answer. My mother stood slowly, raising both hands as if trying to calm a situation that had already passed the point of calming. Adrienne, nobody is saying you didn't help. The word hit me harder than anything else that evening. Help. As if the thousands of hours I had spent managing systems, documents, and deadlines had been a small favor. Help is what someone does once, I said quietly. This was labor. My father slammed both hands against the desk. You don't get to come in here and talk like we exploited you. I met his gaze steadily. Then what would you call it? He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Because there wasn't a good answer, so I gave one. It felt like being the person who kept your permits valid, your insurance active, your tax filings submitted, and your vendor contracts organized, I said. While all of you acted like I should be grateful for the opportunity. Caleb pushed himself off the cabinet. I never asked you to be obsessed with paperwork. Jordan's voice drifted faintly from outside. You literally asked her every week. Caleb ignored them. You always make everything dramatic. I looked at him carefully. No, I said. You just made sure I had to fix everything you broke. My mother stepped forward again. Maddie, please, let's lower our voices. I turned toward her slowly. You still haven't asked how I'm doing. She blinked. What? My surgery, I said. My body. The thing I called about before Dad decided my life was worth less than Caleb's legal trouble. My father stiffened. I did not say that. You said if one of us had to go, I replied calmly. Better me than him? Silence filled the office. My mother looked at the floor. Caleb shifted uncomfortably. My father said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Finally, he straightened and crossed his arms. What do you want? He asked. The question sounded less like concern and more like negotiation. Not what do you need? Not what did we do? What do you want? As if my life had become a business discussion. I thought about the answer carefully. Then I said the only honest thing left. I want out. My mother looked stunned. Out of what? All of it, I said. The business. The emergency calls. The assumption that my life belongs to this family whenever something goes wrong. My father scoffed. You're being melodramatic. No, I said quietly. I'm being late. Then I told them something I hadn't mentioned yet. My lawyer is already preparing the paperwork to remove my name from every compliance record connected to Hale Marine Supply. My father stared at me like I had just spoken another language. You hired a lawyer? Yes. Over this? Over years of this. Caleb muttered something under his breath. My mother sank slowly into the office chair, and my father, for the first time in my entire life, looked uncertain, because the system he had relied on for decades had just collapsed in front of him. Not with shouting, not with revenge, with something far simpler. Refusal. I turned toward the door. Caleb called after me. You think this is going to fix anything? I paused, then looked back at him. No, I said. It's finally going to show the truth. Then I walked out of the office and back toward Jordan's car. For the first time since everything started, my hands weren't shaking anymore. The fear had moved. It no longer lived in me. Now, it lived inside that building. 3 days after the meeting at Hale Marine Supply, I was lying in a hospital bed staring at a ceiling that smelled faintly of disinfectant and recycled air. Funny how life works. For years I had carried my entire family's chaos without ever stopping. Now I couldn't even sit up without help. Jordan sat in the chair beside the bed, scrolling through their phone with the quiet patience of someone who understood that sometimes support meant simply being there. You nervous? They asked without looking up. I thought about it. The nurses had already explained the procedure twice. The surgeon had reassured me that everything should go smoothly. Technically, there was nothing dramatic about the situation. Still, a strange heaviness sat in my chest. Not about the surgery, I said. Jordan glanced up. Then what? My family. Jordan snorted softly. They've been losing their minds all week. I figured. You want the highlights? I hesitated, then nodded. Jordan locked their phone and leaned back in the chair. Your dad spent 2 days arguing with the insurance company. That sounds exhausting. It gets better, Jordan continued. The policy review forced them to submit owner verification documents. Turns out half the compliance contacts still listed your email. I let out a quiet breath. So they had to update everything. Yep. And? Jordan smiled slightly. Your dad hates paperwork more than he hates admitting you were right. That sounded accurate. The nurse entered a few minutes later, cheerful and efficient. All right, she said, checking a tablet. We'll be heading to pre-op shortly. Jordan stood up and stepped aside. I shifted carefully on the bed, the dull ache in my side reminding me why I was here in the first place. It was strange. For weeks, the surgery had felt like the center of my life. Now it almost felt secondary, because the bigger change had already happened. I had stopped carrying my family, and they were finally feeling the weight. The procedure itself passed in a blur. Bright lights, quiet voices, the anesthesiologist explaining something while adjusting a mask, then nothing. When I woke up again, the room looked softer somehow, muted. A nurse adjusted the IV line beside my bed. Welcome back, she said gently. My head felt heavy. How did it go? I managed to ask. Very well. Relief spread slowly through my chest. Somewhere in the room, I heard Jordan's voice. Hey, they said softly, you're awake. I turned my head slightly. Jordan stood beside the bed holding a paper cup of hospital coffee. You look like you fought a small sea monster, they added. That bad? Pretty impressive, actually. Despite the lingering fog in my head, I laughed. Recovery blurred the next day into fragments. Nurses checking vitals, machines beeping quietly, short conversations drifting in and out of my awareness. At some point, Jordan helped me check my phone. The screen lit up with notifications, messages from coworkers, a few from acquaintances, then 2 from my parents. The first came from my mother. "Mom, heard the surgery went okay." No question, no apology, just information. The second message arrived from my father an hour later. "Dad, we need to revisit the business situation when you're recovered." I stared at the screen. Jordan noticed the expression on my face. "Let me guess," they said. "Not exactly a heartfelt apology." I handed them the phone. They read both messages and shook their head. "That's impressive." "In a bad way?" "In a spectacularly tone-deaf way." Jordan handed the phone back. "You know what's weird?" they said. "What?" "You almost died and they're still talking about paperwork." I looked at the quiet hospital room around me. White sheets, soft lighting, a machine gently monitoring my heart rate. Something inside me settled. Not anger, not sadness, something closer to acceptance. Because the messages proved something I had already begun to understand. My parents weren't suddenly going to change, not because of surgery, not because of confrontation, not even because their business was struggling. People rarely rewrite the roles they've been playing for decades. But that didn't mean I had to keep participating. 2 days later, I returned to my apartment, walking slowly, carefully. Jordan insisted on carrying everything while I moved like someone learning a new version of their own body. "Doctor's orders," they said whenever I tried to lift something. The first evening home felt strange, quiet. The harbor outside my window looked peaceful in the fading light. But my phone told a different story. More messages from my father, 3 voicemails, 2 emails, and 1 update from my attorney. I opened that one first. The message was short but important. "Your name is currently still listed as compliance liaison on one insurance renewal filed last quarter. We are requesting formal removal and documentation update." I frowned slightly. "That's odd." Jordan glanced over from the kitchen. "What is?" "My dad renewed an insurance form using my name." "Without asking?" "Apparently." Jordan leaned against the counter. "That sounds illegal." "Not quite," I said slowly. "Just entitled." Because the truth was worse than a crime. My father hadn't forged anything. He had simply assumed my consent still existed. The way people assume electricity will always work when they flip a switch. That night, I lay on the couch with a blanket pulled carefully around my shoulders. My body ached. My mind drifted. Outside, waves rolled steadily against the harbor walls. And somewhere across town, my parents were probably still trying to stabilize the business. But something had shifted permanently. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the person holding everything together. And the strange part was, the world hadn't ended. Hale Marine Supply hadn't exploded overnight. The sky above Port Mason still looked exactly the same. The only real difference was this. The weight that had lived on my shoulders for years was finally resting somewhere else. Recovery gives you a strange kind of clarity. When your body is forced to slow down, your mind finally has space to notice things it ignored before. For the first few days after surgery, I spent most of my time on the couch in my apartment, moving carefully and following the doctor's instructions. Short walks, lots of water, minimal lifting. Jordan stopped by almost every evening with groceries or takeout, making sure I didn't do anything stupid while my body healed. But while my physical world had slowed down, the world outside my apartment seemed to be accelerating, because the consequences of my absence were finally catching up with everyone else. The first sign arrived through my attorney. 3 days after I returned home, he sent another update about the insurance documentation. The email was direct. "Your father continued listing you as the operational compliance contact on a recent policy renewal. We have submitted formal notice requesting immediate correction." I read the message twice, then a third time. Jordan noticed the expression on my face from across the living room. "That doesn't look like good news." "It's not exactly bad news," I said slowly. "What is it then?" "It's confirmation." "Of what?" "That my father assumed my name belonged to his business forever." Jordan leaned back in their chair. "Like a tool." "Exactly. Not malicious, not criminal, just routine entitlement. My father had simply believed the system would always work the way it had before, because for years it had, until now." The attorney's follow-up letter went out the next morning. Clear, professional, uncompromising. Any continued use of my name, contact information, or authorization on Hale Marine Supply documents would now be formally contested. Ownership needed to certify every operational designation moving forward. No more gray areas. No more Adrienne handles that. Just responsibility returning to the people who actually owned the business. When that letter arrived at Hale Marine Supply, something interesting happened. My father stopped calling for 2 full days. The silence felt strange, like the quiet after a storm when the air still feels heavy, but the thunder has finally stopped. Then, on the 3rd day, my mother sent a message. Just one sentence. "Mom, you really were keeping more together than I realized." I stared at the screen for a long time, because that sentence was the closest thing to acknowledgement I had ever received. Not an apology, not even gratitude, just recognition. For years, my parents had treated my work like background noise. Now, suddenly, the silence was impossible to ignore. I didn't respond. Some realizations deserve time to settle. Meanwhile, the outside consequences continued stacking up. Word travels quickly in coastal business communities like Port Mason, especially when something unusual happens. And apparently, a supply company struggling with insurance verification and delayed contracts counts as unusual. Within 2 weeks, several vendors tightened their payment terms. The marina that handled the McAllister shipment postponed their order entirely, and my father was forced to renegotiate part of the company's insurance coverage at a higher premium. Jordan brought the news one evening while dropping off groceries. "Dockside diner gossip," they said, setting a bag on the counter. "My favorite kind. Your dad used to brag about Hale Marine Supply there all the time." "That sounds like him." "Well," Jordan continued, "apparently he's been quieter lately." I leaned back against the couch cushions. "That must be difficult for him." Jordan smiled slightly. "Turns out businesses run better when someone actually manages the details. Funny how that works." Caleb was the first person in my family to crack. He showed up at my apartment one humid evening without warning. Jordan had just arrived with dinner when the pounding started on the door. 3 loud knocks, then another. I opened it carefully. Caleb stood in the hallway, arms crossed, irritation written across his face. His eyes flicked briefly toward the surgical brace resting on the nearby chair. Then he immediately started talking about himself. "Dad says we might lose the McAllister contract." "Then Dad should learn how to run the system he owns," I replied calmly. Caleb scoffed. "You sound insane." "Why?" "Because you're acting like some kind of martyr." Jordan's voice drifted from the kitchen. "Getting arrested at 33 isn't exactly a teenage mistake either." Caleb ignored them. "You always hated that they loved me more." That sentence would have destroyed me a month earlier. Now it simply clarified everything. "No," I said quietly. "I hated that they taught you love should cost me." For the first time since arriving, Caleb hesitated. Then he shook his head. "You think you're punishing them?" "No," I said. "I'm refusing to subsidize the lie." He opened his mouth again, ready to argue, then stopped, because suddenly there was nothing left to argue about. I wasn't asking for anything anymore. I wasn't negotiating. I had simply stepped away. Caleb left 10 minutes later, slamming the stair railing on his way down the apartment building. Jordan watched the door close behind him. "Well," they said. That went about as expected. Later that night, my phone rang again. "Mom." Her voice sounded tired in a way I had never heard before. "I don't know how to fix any of this," she admitted quietly. For a moment, I almost felt sympathy, but then I noticed what she hadn't said. She hadn't asked how my recovery was going. She hadn't apologized. She hadn't acknowledged the surgery at all. She simply wanted the chaos to stop. "You can hire people," I said gently. "That's what businesses do when they need labor." A long silence followed. "We can't afford that right now," she said. I looked around my quiet apartment. "You couldn't afford free either," I replied. Then I ended the call. Over the next week, something interesting happened. The panic in my family slowly turned into reality. Not dramatic collapse, not explosive disaster, just the slow accumulation of consequences that appear when responsibilities finally land where they belong. My parents had to hire outside help to review their compliance filings. They paid a consultant to reorganize vendor documentation. They scheduled meetings with accountants and insurance agents. Every solution required money, and every dollar they spent revealed something they had ignored for years. The work I had done for free had real value. 6 weeks after my surgery, I finally walked through Port Mason's waterfront without feeling pain in my side. The ocean air felt sharp and clean. Fishing boats drifted quietly near the docks, and for the first time in a long time, my life felt calm. Not perfect, but balanced. Because something important had changed. For years, my family believed my absence would destroy them, but that wasn't true. Their habits had been destroying them long before I stepped away. All I had done was stop holding the structure up. And when you remove the person carrying the weight, the real condition of the building becomes impossible to ignore. 6 weeks after my surgery, my body finally started to feel like it belonged to me again. The stiffness in my side faded little by little. Short walks turned into longer ones. Standing in the kitchen long enough to cook a simple meal no longer felt like climbing a mountain. Recovery didn't happen all at once. It arrived quietly, in small victories. The first full night of sleep without pain. The first morning coffee on my balcony overlooking Port Mason Harbor. The first day I returned to the Coastal Maritime Archive part-time, carefully handling a fragile Civil War navigation log while sunlight spilled through the tall windows. For years, my life had revolved around crisis. Someone always needed something. Some document was always urgent. Some problem was always waiting for me to solve it. But now the quiet felt different. Not empty, free. Meanwhile, across town, Hale Marine Supply was learning a lesson it had avoided for years: the cost of invisible labor. My parents eventually hired 2 professionals, an accountant to review their filings, and a compliance consultant to untangle the paperwork systems I had quietly maintained. Jordan told me about it over dinner one evening. Guess how much they're paying the consultant, they said. How much? Almost $2,000 a month. I let out a low whistle. That's impressive. Jordan shrugged. Turns out the work you were doing for free actually costs money. Funny how that works. For years, my parents had treated my effort like something small, a favor, a little help. But once professionals stepped into the same role, the reality became impossible to ignore. The systems I maintained had never been simple. They had been essential. Caleb's situation followed a more predictable path. Without the constant support system cushioning his mistakes, his newest business idea collapsed within 2 months. A logistics consulting venture that had sounded impressive in conversation, but apparently required actual experience to survive. He moved back into my parents' house shortly after. Jordan heard that detail from someone at Dockside Diner. Your dad finally sees it now, they said. Sees what? That Caleb isn't unlucky. He's just Caleb. I didn't respond, because deep down I had understood that truth for years. My parents had simply refused to see it. The town noticed the changes too. Port Mason might not be large, but harbor communities are tightly connected. Word travels easily between marina docks, supply shops, and late-morning coffee counters. People began hearing about delayed shipments, contract changes, higher insurance premiums. Nothing dramatic, just enough shifts to suggest something inside Hale Marine Supply had changed. My father stopped boasting at Dockside Diner. My mother posted fewer smiling photos online. And the familiar story about our family always showing up for each other quietly disappeared. One gray morning near the end of October, my mother asked if we could meet for coffee. The message surprised me, not because she wanted to talk, because the tone sounded different. Less defensive, more honest. We met at a small cafe near the waterfront, the kind of place where locals sit near the windows watching fog roll across the harbor. My mother looked smaller somehow when she walked in. Not physically, emotionally, like someone who had spent weeks confronting truths she once ignored. For a while, we simply sat there, holding our cups. Then she spoke. Your father still thinks this is all because you're angry. I didn't answer. She continued quietly. But I know better now. Those words carried a strange weight, because they were the first honest thing she had said in years. What do you know? I asked. She looked down at the table. That we built our whole life expecting you to catch whatever we dropped. The sentence hung between us. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Not because I disagreed, because I had waited my entire life to hear someone admit it. You should have come first, she said softly. Your surgery should have come first. I nodded slowly. Yes, she sighed. I realized it the moment I saw you in the office that day, and still asked you to fix things before asking if you were okay. Her voice cracked slightly. We let Caleb fail upward for so long that we forgot the difference between helping someone and enabling them. I studied her carefully. The words sounded sincere, but sincerity arrives late sometimes, too late to undo the past. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. She answered immediately. "Because I thought if I waited long enough, you would come back and make everything easier." Honest, painfully honest. "And now?" I asked. "And now I know you won't." My father never gave me that level of honesty. 3 days after the cafe meeting, he sent a message. "Dad, your mother says I owe you an apology. I'm sorry for how things were said." That was it. No acknowledgement of the surgery. No recognition of the choice he made that afternoon. Just the most distant apology possible. It sounded exactly like him. Caleb never apologized at all. Months later, he sent one message asking if I knew anyone who could help him get into logistics consulting. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. Then I blocked the number. Time did something confrontation never could. It dismantled the myth my family had built around itself. My parents learned exactly what it cost to replace the work I once did quietly. Every consultant invoice, every accountant bill, every delayed contract reminded them that what I had provided wasn't help. It was structure, responsibility, stability. And once people understand the true cost of something, they begin seeing the person who used to provide it differently. As for me, healing happened slowly, not just physically, emotionally too. Some days I felt proud of the boundaries I had finally drawn. Other days grief crept in unexpectedly. Not grief for the parents I had. Grief for the parents I spent years believing they might become. Jordan explained it best one night over takeout on my couch. "You didn't lose your family," they said. "You lost the fantasy of them." And that loss hurt more than any surgery. But it also created something new. Space. Space to build a life where my worth wasn't measured by how much chaos I could absorb for other people. If you're listening to this story and wondering what the real ending looks like, it isn't dramatic revenge. My parents didn't lose everything. Caleb didn't suddenly become responsible. My father didn't transform into a different man. Real life rarely gives us those clean endings. But something more important did happen. They finally learned what my absence costs. And I finally learned something that took 30 years to understand. Walking away from people who treat your pain like an inconvenience isn't cruelty. Sometimes it's the most honest act of self-respect you will ever make. And if a story like this reminds you how powerful boundaries can be, there's a simple way to make sure you never miss the next one. Just follow the channel quietly and stay with us for the next story. Because sometimes the strongest revenge isn't destroying the people who hurt you. It's building a life so stable, so peaceful, and so self-respecting that you never need their approval again.